Hey everyone, I'm Andrew Harris, and these are Sur Rons. Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel. In this video, I'm going to be going over basic maintenance for a Sur Ron. Sur Ron Maintenance is comprised of three main categories: the brakes, the chain, and the tires. As you can see on the stock Sur Ron chain, there's a master chain link, which you can remove with any piece of metal. I used my tire spoons as a way to pop off the master chain. Simply remove the cover and then pop out the chain link. You can pull the chain through by rotating the motor. Now let's get rid of this gross chain. These traditional chains stretch and shake, making unnecessary vibrations, and can actually reduce the efficiency of your bike. When removing the rear tire, it's important to prop the bike up first so that we have stability. To make this easier, we should remove the battery because that weighs 30 pounds. This will make our lives a lot easier during the removal process. To remove the rear wheel, I use the Crescent 20-piece socket set. You will also need an Allen key to remove the rear axle. Insert your Allen key into the left side of the axle and your socket wrench to the front. Crank down to release the axle. Once you've released the bolt, you can slide the axle through. The brake caliper is attached with this bracket to the rear axle. Simply pull up and slide out to release. Now our wheel is free. A couple noteworthy things to notice are that the axles are easily removable on either side. These have to stay greased and should be clear of debris. So make sure to clean these or degrease them if you notice anything on the inside. Another important thing to measure is the tension of each of these spokes. They should all be around the same pitch when you pluck them. Any high-pitched ones, you should give a slight counter turn on the nipple here. Over time, the rotors can become worn down and even warped with heat. This is an example of a very, very warped rear rotor that I had to replace off my stock Sur Ron. To remove the rotor, use a star-shaped piece like this to remove each of the 6 bolts around the axle. If the bolts don't come out immediately, that's okay. They use factory Loctite to ensure that it won't loosen up while you're riding. Find the appropriate Allen key to remove the sprocket if you want to switch this out for a 60 tooth or any other aftermarket part. With the mounting bracket for the stock caliper removed from the axle, we have access to the brake pads. Start by removing the metal tab from the right side of the caliper. This will pop off easily with fingernails. The next step will be removing the screw that goes through the brake pads, securing them in place. Find the appropriate Allen key and insert it into the bolt. When you've loosened the screw, remove it by pulling through to the left. Once you've done this, you can release the brake pads. Simply squeeze from either side and pull out through the top. You can notice that these Shimano brake pads have indicators showing left and right for proper alignment inside the caliper. When you open these, you'll find a little steel spacer which helps to keep them from rubbing on the brake rotor. These brake pads still have a ton of life left on them and are perfectly fine for reinstall. Make sure when reinstalling these, you don't touch the surface of the brake pads, as that can cause squeaking on the brake rotor or failure of braking. To reinstall, simply place the steel spacer back onto the brake pads and squeeze them together so that we have a tight fit. Squeeze the brake pads, insert them into the top of the caliper, and push in. You should hear them click into place. Now we can reinstall our bolt that goes through them to make sure that they won't loosen up during riding, and tighten this down. Don't forget to replace the little steel nub on the right side of the caliper. Simply press it down and it should snap into place. It's important to make sure that the caliper stays stable and that we don't have any oil leak. So use an old rotor as a spacer to make sure that the brake pads can't move. When bleeding the front caliper, you first have to remove the caliper. Remove the two bolts securing the caliper. I use this brake bleed kit I bought off Amazon. Attach the bleed tube to the nozzle. Be sure to use high quality mineral oil based brake fluid. I use this Shimano hydraulic brake fluid. Insert the end into the tank and suck until you've filled up with a decent amount of brake fluid. I like to fill it about halfway up. Once it's halfway, I press this to lock it so that we can't drip any oil out. Leave this facing vertically to get rid of any air bubbles that are in the cylinder. Fill your second syringe as well. An easy way to make sure that they're sitting vertically and to get rid of all the air bubbles, I like to hang them from my front wheel. Use the provided Allen key to remove the filler cap on your right brake lever. Be sure to get the little rubber O-ring out as well. Place this fill cap somewhere you won't lose it. Simply take your syringe and screw the bottom into the fill port. Take the appropriate Allen key and remove the axle lock. Then unscrew the axle from the other side. Once it's loosened enough, you can simply pull the axle through. So on the front caliper, we need to unscrew the bleed cap right here. So we're just going to take a screwdriver and undo that. You should be careful about the oil leaking onto the pads. So make sure that you have a paper towel handy to get rid of any excess oil. We're then going to insert our bleed kit into the caliper so that we have a way to pump oil into it. Once again, we're just going to clean this up a little bit, making sure that we don't get any oil onto the brake pads, which could negate our ability to brake and cause the brakes to squeal. So at this point, we're going to unlock each of the tubes so that we can then pump the oil through. So on the top, we're also going to unlock this. And now we're going to push the oil through the kit. So as you can see on the bottom one, when I push this down, the oil comes through and comes up into the bottom tube. Now we're going to repeat the process by squeezing the bottom one and having the oil come up through the top cylinder. You should see some bubbles rising in the top. Bubbles indicate air pockets that were in the tube, and this reduces your ability to brake. Air is a compressible, oil is not. So once you notice that there are no air bubbles, and you've bled it several times, pushing the oil back and forth through the loop, we're going to push almost all of the oil up into the top one and out of the bottom one. And we're going to lock the loop. At this point, we're going to want to remove the top one first. So we're going to unscrew this. Once again, we should expect a little bit of overflow. We're going to replace our valve cap. Once that's nice and tight, we're going to take a minute to clean that up, make sure that there's no excess oil dripping around. We're going to repeat the exact same process. We remove the hose, we find our valve cap, we insert the valve cap, and we screw it in tightly, making sure not to drip any oil on the brake pads. Once it's in all the way, let's once again clean things up a little bit and make sure that we don't have any oil on the brake pads. As you can see, most of it dripped to the right, which is good. We don't want it dripping inside and ruining our brake pads. At this point, we can reattach the brake caliper to the mount. Be sure to leave it a little bit loose so that when we install the brake rotor again, we can properly align it so we don't have any squeaking or squealing. To begin removing the tire, we're going to take our tire spoons and we're going to dig those around the valve to remove the tire from the rim. Continue this process around the perimeter of the tire until the tires come completely off. At that point, you can take the tube out and put your new tubes in. If you want to remove the tire, continue this spooning on the other side of the tire to completely remove it from the rim. For the purposes of this video, I don't need to replace the tire tubes as these are brand new, and the tires still have plenty of wear and tear left on them, so I'm going to leave them in place. To make sure that we don't cause any damage to the rims, after your initial scoop, you can use these rim guards and insert them on the interior of the rim to make sure that we don't cause any dents or scuffs to the paint of the rim. When reinflating the tire, it's important to look at the bead around the edge. This is indicated by the grooved pattern on the edge of the tire. Some parts of it won't be perfectly aligned with the rim, and that's okay. As we inflate the tire, we're going to be tapping it on the ground to make sure that this alignment lines up. To inflate my tires, I use the AirHawk Pro. At around 10 psi, stop pumping air into the tire and remove the nozzle. We're going to roll the tire and press on it to align the bead correctly. At least one full rotation is almost always necessary to make sure the tire is seated properly. At this point, you can see that the bead is properly seated and the tires are properly aligned. It's also important to note that the red dots on the tire indicate the optimal position for the valve. This is because this is the lightest point on the tire and it'll make for a very balanced tire at high speeds. Personally, I like running a pressure around 15 psi. At higher speeds, higher pressures are necessary for stability purposes. At this point, our tires are ready to be reinstalled. To properly reinstall the tire, we first need to make sure that the brake caliper and its mounting bracket are correctly positioned on the swing arm. Make sure that this little gap on the bottom of the mounting bracket properly aligns with the nub on the inside of the swing arm. Slide this on and make sure that the bearings align with the axle holes. Lift the wheel into the caliper so that the rotor fits snugly in between the two brake pads. Once this is in position, we can replace the axle. Push the axle through the wheel and into the other side of the swing arm. Make sure that the brake rotor and caliper are properly seated on the left side of the swing arm. At this point, we're going to reattach the fastening bolts on the right side of the swing arm. Attach the bolt, but only finger tighten it because we still need to adjust for the chain tension. The axle should be able to freely move forward and backward about an inch. Now it's time to install our gold O-ring chain. Simply lay the chain around the sprocket and feed the chain up into the sprocket around the axle of the swing arm. It may be difficult to get the chain up and over the small sprocket on the rear axle, so use the opposite side's pulley to rotate this axle and help guide the chain over the top of the sprocket. This is easily accomplished with a little bit of practice. Once it's through, you can simply pull the chain and it should go over the top of the axle. Properly feed it through the rear swing arm and over the top of the rear sprocket. Test the fitment of the chain. If there's too much space, slide the axle forward. If there's too little space, slide it backwards. In this case, there's almost just enough space, and we're gonna slightly tension this chain until we think we can get the master chain link on. Take your piece of master chain and insert it into one side of the chain. Lift up the other side and insert it through. Make sure that the O-rings are still attached to the far side of the chain. On the near side, we're going to need to manually insert the O-rings. Slide them onto each of the two axles within the chain, and then put on the other side of the master chain. We're going to lock it all up with the master chain lock by pushing it down and taking any piece of metal to lock it in place. Once again, I like using my tire spoons as a way to push on the master chain link. With it clicked into place, our chain is now properly attached. If the chain has too much looseness or too much play, we can adjust the linkage on the rear axle by twisting this bolt. Adjust it until the chain is nice and firm and only has about an inch of play. Any more than that and it'll be excessive chain rattle. Any less than that and you'll be running too tight a chain. Our final step in reinstalling the chain is proper lubrication. Take any liquid wrench or cable lube and apply it to the chain. Be sure to block it from getting on the rear rotor. Twist the sprocket to apply it to the whole chain. When you notice that the whole chain is nicely saturated in the lubricant, you're done. Our final step is making sure that the rear axle is properly tightened. Take our crescent wrench and tighten the bolt down until it won't go any further, holding the opposite side of the axle with your Allen key. To reinstall the front wheel, we're just going to reverse the process. We're going to lift up the wheel and insert the rotor into the caliper. Make sure that these axle caps don't pop out during the reinstallation process. Let's take our axle and thread it through the rear side of the front fork. Tapping it will get it all the way through. Let's take our large Allen key and tighten the axle. When the axle stops moving, don't excessively tighten it. It's all the way in. Let's take our axle lock and twist that the direction that the indicator shows. This can be slightly counterintuitive, as it is a lefty-tighty, righty-loosey. Once again, tighten it, but don't over-tighten. Our front wheel is now reinstalled. When we reinstalled the front caliper, we made sure to leave it nice and loose so that we can move it so that the front rotor doesn't rub against it excessively. Keep it nice and loose and spin the wheel freely. Adjust it slightly until you no longer hear scraping. At this point, retighten the front caliper. Our final step will be reinstalling the battery and taking it off the jack. In this case, I'm using a folding chair. I'm going to lift from the subframe underneath the seats and the compartment to the right of the battery. This gives you a good grip on the bike and won't allow you to drop it. We're gonna drop our battery back on in. Once again, it's very important to note that the circuit breaker inside of it is on black. If it is on red, then this battery cable, when you plug it in, could actually arc from the battery and could potentially hurt you. Be careful, red is dead, black is safe. At this point, we can turn the circuit breaker back on. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you learned something. If you like this video, please comment, rate, and subscribe for more daily Sur Ron content.
Let me tell you a little about Andy's bike. It has two wheels, one of which is actually not on right now, and I'm guessing there's a brake. Okay.